1 year to the day after Dr. Angela Richardson had walked into Judge Michael Bennett's traffic court, they stood together outside Boston's newly renovated Hall of Justice. A large crowd had gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony of the country's first Center for Judicial Equality and Reform, a space that would serve as a hub for training, advocacy, and innovation in the pursuit of fair and equitable justice. The project had started with an unexpected moment, a simple $120 parking ticket, but it had led to an extraordinary transformation not only for Judge Bennett but for the entire justice system in Boston, and beyond. As Sarah Bennett, now a full-time legal correspondent, stood with her camera crew capturing the historic moment, she leaned in to whisper to her father, "Hard to believe it all started with a $120 parking ticket." Her voice was filled with a mix of pride and disbelief. Dr. Richardson, standing beside her, smiled that familiar, knowing smile. They had come a long way from the cold, impersonal courtroom where she had been unfairly fined, to this moment of celebration and transformation. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Dr. Richardson replied. "But now we're all walking the path together." The Center for Judicial Equality and Reform occupied an entire floor of the newly renovated Hall of Justice. From the outside, the glass walls allowed the public to see into the modern training rooms, the conference spaces, and the state-of-the-art courtroom that had been specially designed to ensure that every piece of evidence could be properly presented and reviewed, free from bias or error. This facility was not just a new building, it was a symbol of the reform movement that had taken root in Boston's justice system. As the ribbon-cutting ceremony began, Mayor Chin stepped up to the podium. 1 year ago, a traffic court incident could have been just another example of bias in our justice system, he said. Instead, thanks to Judge Bennett's courage to admit his mistakes and Dr. Richardson's vision for change, it became the catalyst for the largest judicial reform movement in our city's history. The crowd responded with applause, acknowledging the significant strides that had been made. Judge Bennett stood at the front, his wife sitting in the front row, beaming with pride. James Cooper and Judge Williams, once critics of Bennett's methods, were now active members of the mentorship program that had evolved as part of the reform. Even some of Bennett's harshest critics had come to support the opening of the new center, recognizing the importance of the work they were doing. The changes they had implemented were not just theoretical, they were real, tangible improvements to how justice was practiced. Dr. Richardson took the podium next. "This center represents more than just a building," she said, her voice strong and clear. "It represents our commitment to examining our biases, correcting our mistakes, and ensuring true justice for everyone who enters our courts." She gestured to the wall behind her where a simple framed document hung. It was the original $120 parking ticket that had started the whole journey, a symbol of injustice that had led to a movement for change. Beside it was a statistical report showing the racial disparities in traffic court rulings before the reforms had been put in place. "Today," Dr. Richardson continued, "I am proud to announce that our reform program has been adopted by 50 courthouses across the country. Over 500 judges have completed our training, and case appeal rates have dropped by 60% in participating courts." The crowd erupted into applause, impressed by the widespread success of the initiative and the far-reaching impact it had had on the justice system. Judge Bennett stepped up to speak next. "A year ago, I was a judge who thought he knew everything about justice," he began. "Then Dr. Richardson taught me the most important lesson of my career, that true justice requires constant growth, honest self-reflection, and the courage to change." As he spoke, the doors of the center opened for the first time, revealing a high-tech, fully equipped facility. Inside, video screens displayed real-time statistics from courts across the city, showing the dramatic drop in discriminatory rulings and increased satisfaction rates from court participants of all backgrounds. Sarah, standing with her camera crew, called out to her father, "Dad, any words for other judges who might be resistant to change?" Bennett turned toward the camera, his face serious but compassionate. "Look at your own rulings, really look at them," he said. "If you find patterns of bias like I did, remember, admitting mistakes isn't weakness, it's the first step toward true justice." His words carried weight, offering a powerful message to other judges who might still be reluctant to confront their own biases. After the ceremony, Bennett and Dr. Richardson walked through the new center together. The training rooms were already filled with judges and attorneys, all working together to review cases and discuss reforms. In one room, Judge Williams was leading a session on recognizing unconscious bias. His voice could be heard from outside, urging his colleagues to reflect on their own judgments and to be mindful of the biases they might not even realize they held. "Remember when you said this was just the beginning?" Bennett asked, pausing beside the frame holding his original $120 traffic ticket. I had a feeling about you, Dr. Richardson smiled. Even when you were unfairly finding me, I saw something in your eyes, the potential for change. The pair continued their tour, eventually reaching the new model courtroom, designed with their reforms in mind. Clear sight lines ensured that judges could make eye contact with everyone, fostering a sense of connection and fairness. Multiple screens allowed evidence to be easily displayed, ensuring that no critical information would be overlooked. Signs in various languages welcomed all participants, acknowledging the diverse community they served. Next week we start training judges from California, Dr. Richardson said, checking her tablet. The governor there wants to implement our program statewide. Bennett nodded, impressed by the growing national interest in their work. Then it's official, Dr. Richardson added, her phone buzzing with a message from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Considering national implementation of your reform program. Available for a meeting next month? As they walked back to their offices, they passed the traffic court where their story had begun. Through the window they could see James Cooper, now a passionate reform advocate, carefully reviewing evidence in each case. He took the time to listen to every person who came before him, ensuring that all voices were heard, no matter their background. You know what I learned from all this? Bennett asked, pausing to watch his friend at work. What's that? Dr. Richardson replied. Sometimes the biggest changes in life come from our biggest mistakes, Bennett said, his voice thoughtful. And the wisest people are those willing to learn from them, Dr. Richardson responded, a smile crossing her face. They reached their offices side by side, their nameplates gleaming on the doors. Judge Michael Bennett and Dr. Angela Richardson, co-directors of the Center for Judicial Equality and Reform. It had been a long journey, but one that had changed countless lives, including their own. Ready for another year? Dr. Richardson asked, looking at Bennett. Always, he replied, thinking of all the lives they had touched, the systems they had changed, and the work still to be done. Justice is a journey, not a destination. The National Judicial Conference in Washington, D.C., was buzzing with excitement as over 3,000 judges, lawyers, and legal experts filled the grand ballroom of the Capitol Hotel. Judge Bennett stood backstage, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. Nervous? Dr. Richardson appeared beside him, looking elegant in a deep purple suit. The great Judge Bennett afraid of public speaking? She teased. Bennett smiled wryly. The last time I spoke at a national event, I was teaching other judges how to clear their dockets quickly, he said. Now I'm telling them to slow down and question everything they think they know. Sarah rushed backstage, her press badge swinging around her neck. She had taken the assignment specifically to cover this event. Dad. Dr. Richardson. You won't believe who's out there. 3 Supreme Court justices, the Attorney General, and judges from every state. Dr. Richardson checked her presentation slides one last time. The data they had collected was compelling. In the 6 months since implementing their reforms, case appeal rates had dropped by 40%, and public trust in the courts had significantly improved. 2 minutes, the conference coordinator called. Bennett's phone buzzed with a message from James Cooper, front row with the other converted skeptics. Make us proud. Several judges who had initially opposed Bennett's changes were now among his strongest supporters, implementing similar reforms in their own courts. The conference chair stepped up to the microphone. Our next speakers need no introduction, she said. Their story has become a catalyst for judicial reform across the country. Please welcome Judge Michael Bennett and Dr. Angela Richardson. The applause was thunderous as they walked onto the stage. Bennett noticed his old mentor, Judge Williams, sitting near the back, nodding slightly in approval. 6 months ago, Bennett began, I found a black woman in my traffic court without even looking at her evidence. He paused, letting that sink in. That woman was Dr. Richardson, and that mistake changed my life, and hopefully will help change our justice system. Dr. Richardson stepped forward. What happened next wasn't just about one judge admitting his biases, she said. It was about creating a model for real, systemic change. They presented their program, mandatory bias training, regular case reviews, mentorship partnerships between judges and civil rights attorneys, and technological updates to ensure that all evidence could be properly displayed and considered. The results speak for themselves, Dr. Richardson continued, her voice steady and proud. The audience was rapt, and the applause that followed was the sound of a movement gaining momentum. The conference room was buzzing with energy as judges, lawyers, and legal experts filled the ballroom for the final session of the Judicial Reform Seminar. After presenting their program, Judge Michael Bennett and Dr. Angela Richardson stood together as they discussed the statistics that showcased the remarkable success of their judicial reforms. When judges take time to examine their biases and truly listen to each case, justice improves for everyone, Dr. Richardson said, her voice strong and clear. Bennett nodded in agreement. He had experienced it firsthand. During the question and answer session, a judge from Texas stood up, a skeptical look on his face. "This all sounds great," he said. "But we have busy dockets. We can't spend all day on traffic tickets." Bennett smiled, recognizing the resistance that many judges felt when confronted with the reality of change. "6 months ago I would have said the same thing," he responded. "Let me ask you this. Would you rather process cases quickly or process them correctly?" The room fell silent as the weight of the question settled over the audience. A judge from the front row raised her hand. "I've been following your work," she said. "Last week I reversed one of my own rulings after recognizing my bias." The relief on that defendant's face. "It changed something in me." Her voice wavered slightly, but there was a clear sense of conviction in her words. Bennett and Dr. Richardson exchanged a look, proud of the impact their reforms were having on the judicial community. After the presentation, a crowd gathered around the two reformers. Judges were eager to implement their program in their own courts, law schools were requesting copies of their materials, and court administrators were inquiring about the technological upgrades they had introduced. Sarah, now an established legal correspondent, appeared with her recorder in hand. "Time for an interview with the dynamic duo," she joked, referencing the pair's growing fame. As they answered her questions, Bennett noticed James Cooper, his old friend and now an advocate for judicial reform, deep in conversation with Dr. Richardson's mentorship team. 3 other judges were signing up for the program, recognizing its potential to help them grow as fairer, more reflective jurists. Bennett's phone buzzed with a message from his wife. "Just saw you on C-SPAN. Looking good up there, honey. By the way, guess who came to traffic court today? Judge Williams." He sat through the whole session, taking notes. A wave of pride washed over him. Judge Williams, once one of his fiercest critics, had not only embraced the changes Bennett had introduced, but had also become an active supporter of the reforms. It was proof that change was possible, even for the most entrenched individuals. Later that evening at the conference dinner, Chief Justice Chen raised her glass to toast Bennett and Dr. Richardson. "For reminding us that true justice requires both courage and humility," she said. The room erupted into applause, and Bennett shared a private smile with Dr. Richardson. She leaned over to him, her voice filled with satisfaction. "Not bad for a traffic ticket, huh?" she teased. Bennett chuckled, shaking his head. "You planned this all along, didn't you?" he asked. "That day in my courtroom?" "Not exactly," Dr. Richardson replied with a smile. "But I recognized an opportunity when I saw one." Bennett looked around the room, taking in the scene. Sarah was proudly showing other reporters the materials from her father's presentation, explaining the intricacies of the reform program. James Cooper was enthusiastically explaining the mentorship program to a group of interested judges, while his old mentor, Judge Williams, quietly observed it all, a subtle nod of approval on his face. Bennett's heart swelled with gratitude. "You know," he said to Dr. Richardson, "when I first realized who you were in that committee meeting, I thought my career was over. And now I realize it was just beginning." He raised his glass to traffic tickets that changed lives. Dr. Richardson clinked her glass against his. "To justice that sees everyone," she said, her words a testament to their shared mission and vision. 3 months after the review board hearing, Judge Bennett sat in a newly renovated courtroom. The changes were subtle but significant. A larger evidence display screen ensured that all visual evidence could be displayed more clearly. The courtroom signage had been updated to include multiple languages, ensuring that all visitors and participants, regardless of their background, could easily navigate the space. The waiting area had been expanded, providing a more comfortable environment for defendants, witnesses, and attorneys. These changes were part of a broader initiative to make the court more accessible and equitable, and today was a particularly special day. Dr. Richardson would be appearing in his court as an attorney for the first time since their initial encounter. The case before them was that of a young Hispanic man, Miguel Rodriguez, who was accused of running a red light. However, video evidence clearly supported his claim that he had been trying to avoid an ambulance that was rushing through the intersection. The courtroom was unusually full for a traffic case. Several lawyers, judges, and even a few law students had come to observe this particular hearing, recognizing the significance of the case. As the clerk called the court to order, "All rise," Bennett entered the room, his gaze immediately drawn to Dr. Richardson, who stood confidently beside her client, Miguel Rodriguez. "Your Honor," Dr. Richardson began, We have video evidence from a nearby security camera showing the ambulance approaching the intersection. She gestured to the screen where the video began to play, showing Rodriguez's car moving to the side to allow the ambulance to pass. Bennett nodded, maintaining eye contact with both Dr. Richardson and her client. The simple act of making direct eye contact with the defendant, something that had been overlooked in his previous years as a judge, was one of many small yet significant changes he had implemented. As the evidence played out, Bennett listened carefully, asking relevant questions and reviewing all the necessary documentation. The entire process took about 15 minutes, which was considerably longer than his previous traffic court sessions, but Bennett was no longer focused on rushing through cases. Based on the evidence presented, Bennett made his ruling. "The citation is dismissed," he said. "Mr. Rodriguez acted appropriately in an emergency situation." He looked directly at the young man, offering a reassuring smile. "Thank you for prioritizing the ambulance's passage. You made the right decision." Miguel Rodriguez's relieved smile was the reward for the extra time and attention Bennett had given the case. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. The young man was not just a name on a docket. He was a person seeking justice, and Bennett had taken the time to ensure he received it. As the courtroom began to empty, a reporter from the Boston Globe approached Bennett's clerk with a question. The story of his transformation from a judge who had once been blinded by bias to a leader in judicial reform had sparked national interest in the potential for reform in courts across the country. During the lunch break, Dr. Richardson knocked on Bennett's chamber door. "That was quite different from our first meeting," she said, entering with 2 sandwiches. Their working lunches had become a weekly tradition, and Bennett welcomed the break from his responsibilities. He accepted the sandwich, taking a bite as he considered her words. "I had a good teacher," he replied, but his curiosity got the better of him. "I'm curious, why this case? You don't usually take traffic violations anymore." Dr. Richardson sat down across from him, her expression thoughtful. "Miguel Rodriguez's story reminded me of something," she said. "When I was in law school, my brother faced a similar situation. The judge wouldn't even look at his evidence. That's what inspired me to focus on judicial reform." Her eyes softened as she spoke, and Bennett could see how deeply this cause resonated with her. Their lunch was interrupted by a video call from Sarah. "Dad, you're trending again?" Sarah said, her voice excited. "The law blog just posted about today's case. They're calling it the Bennett effect. Judges are taking extra time to review evidence in cases they might have rushed through before." Bennett shook his head, still uncomfortable with the attention. "I'm just doing my job," he said, though there was a hint of pride in his voice. "The way it should have been done all along." Dr. Richardson smiled. "Speaking of which," she said, "the National Judicial Conference called. They want us to present our reform program next month." "Us?" Bennett raised an eyebrow. "Of course, us," Dr. Richardson replied. "This has always been a partnership." She pulled out her tablet, tapping away as she continued. "Actually, I've been working on something new. What do you think about a mentorship program, pairing experienced judges with civil rights attorneys for regular case reviews?" Before Bennett could respond, James Cooper appeared at the door. "Mind if I join you?" he asked hesitantly. "I've been watching your court sessions all week, Mike. I think I need to review some of my own cases." Bennett and Dr. Richardson exchanged glances. "Pull up a chair," Bennett said, motioning for his friend to join them. "We were just discussing a new mentorship program." As they continued discussing cases and reforms, Bennett's clerk brought in the afternoon docket. Looking at the names and cases, Bennett realized something profound. He no longer made assumptions based on people's names or appearances. Each case was simply a human being seeking justice, and he was there to ensure they received it. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "Dinner tonight with Sarah before she flies back. Dr. Richardson is welcome to join us." Bennett smiled, remembering how tense things had been just a few months ago. Now this family was proud of him. His court was serving justice more effectively, and even his former critics were becoming allies. "Sarah's flight isn't until late," Bennett said to the others. "Dinner at Morrow's? We can keep working on the mentorship proposal." Dr. Richardson checked her calendar. "I'm free." James Cooper, who had been quietly observing the exchange, looked surprised at the invitation but nodded. "I'd like that," he said. As they continued discussing cases and reforms, Bennett realized that what had started as a simple traffic court confrontation had grown into something much bigger. A movement for change that was spreading court by court, judge by judge, case by case. It was a transformation that had begun with a single simple mistake but had evolved into a nationwide initiative to reshape the very fabric of the judicial system. The State Judicial Review Board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m., but protesters had already gathered outside the courthouse by 7:30. The movement was gaining momentum and Judge Bennett was at the forefront, leading the charge for reform. The sun was barely rising over the courthouse when Judge Michael Bennett and Dr. Angela Richardson arrived for what promised to be the most challenging day of their careers. The protests outside were already in full swing. Some held signs supporting their efforts, honesty, justice, and reform our courts. But others had more hostile messages like, betrayed us and keep politics out of our courts. Dr. Richardson's car pulled up to the back entrance, and Bennett was already there, waiting with 2 coffee cups in hand. Quite a crowd out front, Dr. Richardson remarked, accepting the coffee with a knowing smile. Bennett nodded, his face grim. Your former colleagues are really pushing hard to remove me from the bench, he said, leading her into the building. 7 judges have signed the petition against me. Dr. Richardson listened quietly as they made their way inside. Including my mentor, Judge Williams, Bennett added, his voice tinged with a mixture of regret and disappointment. He had never imagined that his mentor, someone he had always admired and looked up to, would become one of his strongest opponents. The 2 of them walked to a small conference room, where the documents for their presentation were spread out across the table. Bennett straightened his tie and looked over the materials for the last time, trying to calm the nerves that had been building up since the news of the petition had broken. Just as they began to prepare, the door opened suddenly and Sarah, Bennett's daughter, rushed in. Dad, she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him. I took the first flight from Chicago when I heard about the removal petition. She pulled back, her eyes full of concern. Dr. Richardson smiled. Perfect timing, she said, as Sarah's presence seemed to lighten the tension in the room. We could use another lawyer on our side today. Before anyone could say more, Thomas Hayes, their legal coordinator, hurried into the room, his face tight with urgency. They're starting early, he announced. The opposition is pushing for an immediate hearing. They're waiting now. Bennett took a deep breath and straightened his papers. All right, he said, his voice steady despite the anxiety that was creeping in. Let's go. They walked to the main courtroom, where 9 members of the review board were already seated at the front. Their faces were stern and unreadable, and along one side sat the judges who had filed the petition against Bennett, including his former mentor, Judge Williams, and James Cooper, a colleague who had once been a close friend. News cameras lined the back wall, their lenses trained on the proceedings. It was clear that this hearing was going to be a spectacle. Chief Justice Martha Chen spoke first, her voice echoing through the room as she called the session to order. We are here to consider the petition for removal of Judge Michael Bennett, she said. This petition is based on his public statement admitting to biased rulings and his subsequent actions, which, according to the petitioners, have brought the judicial system into disrepute. Judge Williams stood up first, his white hair and distinguished presence commanding attention. Judge Bennett has violated the most basic principle of our profession, maintaining public confidence in the courts, he said, his voice cold and accusatory. By admitting to bias and reversing his own rulings, he has opened every judicial decision to question. He must be removed. The other opposing judges followed, each one painting Bennett's actions as a threat to the integrity of the judicial system. They argued that his public admission of bias was dangerous, suggesting that it could erode trust in the courts and undermine the credibility of judges everywhere. As they spoke, Sarah squeezed her father's hand, offering him silent support. Bennett could feel the weight of their words, but he remained composed. He knew that the fight they were in now was bigger than just his own career, it was about the future of the entire judicial system. Finally, it was their turn to speak. Dr. Richardson stood up first, her voice clear and powerful. Distinguished members of the board, she began, her words resonating throughout the room, you are not here to judge whether bias exists in our courts. Judge Bennett merely admitted what statistics have shown for years. Bias is present in the system and it affects the way cases are handled. What you are here to decide is whether honesty and a commitment to change deserve punishment. She paused and displayed their research on the screen behind her. It was a detailed study showing the extent of bias in the judicial system and the positive impact that transparency and reform could have. The room grew quiet as the board members took in the information. Judge Bennett stood next. 30 years ago when I was sworn in as a judge, I promised to uphold justice, he began. His voice was firm but filled with sincerity. But somewhere along the way I forgot that justice requires constant self-examination. Dr. Richardson helped me see my own biases, not to tear down the system but to make it better. He turned to face his former mentor, Judge Williams. You taught me that a judge's greatest virtue is wisdom. Well, I've learned that true wisdom includes admitting when we're wrong. The room was still as Bennett spoke, his words cutting through the tension in the air. The moment was heavy with the weight of years of tradition, yet it felt revolutionary in its simplicity. Judge Williams did not respond immediately, his expression unreadable. Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly but full of conviction. I'm not just Judge Bennett's daughter, she said, glancing toward the board members. I'm a public defender in Chicago. Every day I see the same biases my father admitted to. But because of his courage to face them, other judges are beginning to listen when we raise these issues. The room fell silent. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Chief Justice Chen whispered to the other board members, and the wait stretched on, seeming endless. Finally she spoke. This board has never faced a situation quite like this, she said, her voice measured and thoughtful. Judge Bennett's actions are unprecedented. She paused, looking directly at him. However, sometimes unprecedented actions are exactly what justice requires. She turned to the board members. The petition for removal is denied. The room erupted into noise. Supporters cheered, and the opposing judges stormed out, their faces red with frustration. News reporters rushed to get statements, but Bennett barely noticed. He was too focused on the overwhelming relief that swept through him. For the first time in weeks he could breathe again. As the chaos of the courtroom settled, Judge Williams approached Bennett. He still wore a stern expression, but his voice was quieter now. I still think you're wrong about this, he said gruffly. Then, more softly, he added, but I respect your courage. Later that evening, Bennett, Sarah, and Dr. Richardson sat together in a quiet restaurant, the weight of the day slowly lifting. The three of them clinked glasses in a private celebration. So, Dr. Richardson said, raising her glass, ready for Phase 2? Phase 2? Sarah asked, her eyebrows raised. Bennett smiled. Keeping my job was just the beginning, he said. Now we start implementing real changes across the entire system. Dr. Richardson nodded, her eyes shining with determination. And this time we'll do it right. Bennett raised his glass. To justice, he said. To justice, Sarah echoed. Dr. Richardson smiled, that familiar slight smile that Bennett had come to recognize as her mark of approval. A month after the press conference, Judge Bennett sat alone in his chambers late one night. His desk was covered with letters, some supportive, others critical of his public admission of bias. The evening news was playing quietly on his computer, showing a replay of the press conference with Dr. Richardson. His cell phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Dad, just saw you on the news again. Mom and I are proud of you. But have you seen the comments online? Bennett sighed and opened his laptop. The top legal blog in Boston had published a new article, Judge Bennett, Hero or Traitor to the Bench? The comments section was a battlefield filled with opposing views. Some praised his honesty, while others called for his resignation. The debate over his actions was far from over. A knock on his door interrupted his reading. It was James Cooper, his oldest friend on the bench. Bennett gestured for him to sit. We need to talk, James said without preamble, his face tight with frustration. Bennett motioned to the chair. I was wondering when you'd show up, he replied quietly. James's voice was sharp with disbelief. What are you doing, Mike? First you side with Dr. Richardson against Thomas, and now you're reviewing every ruling you've ever made. Do you know what this is doing to the rest of us? Bennett remained calm, his voice steady. Making you uncomfortable? He asked. James slammed his hand on the desk. Making us look bad. Every defense attorney in town is now requesting reviews of their cases. They're using your confession as evidence of systemic bias. Good, Bennett said, surprising himself with his firmness. Maybe it's time we all looked closer at our decisions? James stared at him in disbelief. The Mike Bennett I know would never. The Mike Bennett you knew was part of the problem, Bennett interrupted. Did you know I've reversed 67 of my own rulings from the past year? 67 times I made the wrong call because I didn't check my biases. You can't change the whole system. Mike, James said, shaking his head. Watch me try, Bennett replied, his voice resolute. After James left, Bennett pulled out the latest report he and Dr. Richardson had prepared. Tomorrow they would present their findings to the State Judicial Review Board. Their recommendations would affect every courtroom in Massachusetts. As his phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Dr. Richardson, Bennett couldn't help but smile. The work was far from over, but with each case, each decision, he knew they were making a difference. Judge Michael Bennett had been in this fight for what felt like a lifetime, but the weight of his choices never seemed to lessen. The original citation that Dr. Angela Richardson had given him, the small fee of $120, had become an ironic reminder of how far they had come, how much had changed, and how small the dollar amount now seemed in comparison to the shifts that had rippled through the justice system as a result of their work. It had been a turning point, a seed planted that had grown into something far greater than either of them had anticipated. Sitting in his office one evening, Bennett opened his email, expecting the usual mix of routine correspondence. But his heart skipped a beat when he saw the subject line of a new message: Emergency Meeting, Judicial Conduct Committee. His mind immediately jumped to the worst-case scenario. Several judges were calling for his removal, claiming that his public admissions about his biases had irreparably damaged the court's reputation. He sat back in his chair, the familiar dread creeping in, but this time instead of panic, a strange calm settled over him. With steady fingers, Bennett forwarded the email to Dr. Richardson. The simple message he typed, "Ready for another battle," was followed by his finger hovering for a moment over the keyboard. Then, with a deep breath, he hit send. A few moments later, a reply pinged in his inbox from Dr. Richardson. *always. But this time you're not fighting alone*. Bennett felt a surge of gratitude. When he had first started his journey, he had been isolated, unsure of how much he could change on his own. Now, it seemed like the fight for reform had taken on a momentum of its own. His actions, his willingness to admit his flaws, had sparked a movement that was bigger than any one individual. He looked over at the photo on his desk. His daughter, Sarah, standing next to him at her law school graduation. She was now a public defender in Chicago, and just last week she had called him, her voice choked with emotion. "Dad, your courage made me do something I never thought I could," she had said, explaining how his actions had inspired her to challenge a judge's biased ruling in one of her cases. She had won, standing up for the very values he had espoused in his own courtroom. That moment had been a turning point for Sarah, just as his was for him. She was no longer the young girl looking up to her father from the sidelines. Now she was taking her own steps toward justice, armed with the courage he had shown her. Now, as he sat in his courtroom, the darkened space seemed to press in around him. The usual hum of activity was gone, and the silence was heavy with the weight of reflection. He thought about all the people who had stood before him over the years. How many of them had been judged unfairly? How many lives had he affected, ruined even, without even realizing it? His implicit biases had affected his judgments, and it had taken him this long to see the truth of it. His phone buzzed one last time that night. The number was unfamiliar, but the message was direct. Judge Bennett, I appeared in your court 2 years ago. You wouldn't accept my evidence, and as a result, I lost my license. After seeing you on the news, I'm requesting a review. Thank you for admitting you were wrong. It gives me hope. Bennett sat back in his chair, the weight of the message sinking in. This wasn't just about his own mistakes anymore. This was about real people, real consequences. And now, someone was taking action because he had taken responsibility for his actions. It was a humbling realization, and for the first time, it seemed as if the path forward wasn't just a series of battles, it was a chance to make things right. The next morning, Bennett stood outside Dr. Richardson's office, balancing 2 coffee cups and his heavy briefcase. Through the glass walls of her office, he could see her already hard at work, piles of files stacked around her desk like a fortress. When he knocked on her door, she called out, "Come in." He entered, placing one of the coffee cups on her desk with a nod. "Vanilla latte," he said with a small smile. The receptionist said, "It's your usual." Dr. Richardson raised an eyebrow, surprised by his thoughtfulness, but she quickly returned to business. "I've pulled the records for every traffic case you handled in the past year," she said, gesturing toward the mountain of papers on her desk. "That's 847 cases. Ready to see some uncomfortable truths?" For the next 3 hours they combed through case after case. Dr. Richardson had meticulously created a detailed spreadsheet that outlined patterns in Bennett's rulings, patterns that he had never noticed before, or perhaps had chosen not to see. The statistics were stark. There were higher fines for minorities, shorter listening times for non-white defendants, and descriptions in court records that painted racial or class-based assumptions into the way cases were processed. "Look at these 2 cases," Dr. Richardson said, pulling out 2 files from the pile. Same violation, same location, same time of day. The white business executive got a warning, and the black school teacher got a $200 fine. Bennett rubbed his temples as the weight of the evidence became undeniable. I remember both cases, he said quietly. I thought I was being fair. I didn't know, I couldn't have known, how deep the bias ran. Dr. Richardson's tone was professional but not unkind as she explained. That's how implicit bias works. We make split-second decisions based on deeply rooted assumptions, and often we don't even realize we have them. Suddenly, a knock on the door interrupted their work. Thomas Hayes, the managing partner, stuck his head in. The press is downstairs, he said, his voice tense. Someone leaked about Judge Harris's racist comments and your connection to the case, Bennett. They're asking for your comments on judicial bias. Dr. Richardson and Bennett exchanged looks. We need to get ahead of this, she said, standing up. What do you suggest? Bennett asked, surprising both Hayes and Richardson with his willingness to follow her lead. The truth, she replied simply. But first, we need to show that we're actually doing something about it. For the next hour, they worked quickly to organize their findings into a clear, concise presentation. Dr. Richardson pulled up statistics, case studies, and their proposed reforms. Bennett added his own personal insights, acknowledging his past mistakes and detailing the specific changes he planned to implement in his courtroom to avoid perpetuating the biases they had uncovered. At noon, they faced the press together in the firm's main conference room. The camera flashes were blinding as they approached the podium side by side. Dr. Richardson spoke first, her voice calm but authoritative. Good afternoon. We are here to address not just one incident, but a systemic issue in our judicial system. Judge Bennett stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never been one to welcome the spotlight, but today it was not about him. It was about something far larger than any individual. I stand before you today not just as a judge, but as someone who has recognized his own faults, he said, his voice steady despite the nerves. A few weeks ago, I found Dr. Richardson unjustly in my courtroom, without even looking at her evidence. That was one example of hundreds where my unconscious biases affected my judgment. Since then, working with Dr. Richardson, I've reviewed my past rulings and found disturbing patterns. The reporters' pens scratched across their notepads as they scribbled frantically, the cameras flashing in rapid succession. A reporter stood up, their voice cutting through the noise. Judge Bennett, are you admitting to racial bias in your courtroom? The room fell silent. Bennett could feel sweat beginning to form on his forehead as he remembered all the cases they had reviewed that morning. He thought about the people whose lives he had impacted, whose cases had been handled with bias and assumptions, and for the first time he didn't flinch. Yes, he said firmly. And I'm committed to fixing it. After the press conference, back in Dr. Richardson's office, both Bennett and she collapsed into chairs, emotionally drained by the whirlwind of the last few hours. That was unexpected, Dr. Richardson said, glancing at him with newfound respect. Most people wouldn't have admitted everything so publicly. Bennett met her gaze. Most people haven't had their eyes open the way you opened mine. Did you plan all this when you walked into that committee meeting last week? She asked, her tone playful yet curious. Dr. Richardson smiled, that familiar slight smile. I plan to create change, Judge Bennett. The method? Well, sometimes life gives us unexpected opportunities. As his phone buzzed with messages from other judges, some supportive, others angry, Bennett ignored them. Instead, he picked up another case file from her desk. We still have about 600 more cases to review, he said. Shall we continue? Dr. Richardson nodded, reaching for her coffee. The real work had only just begun, but for the first time in his career, Bennett felt like genuine change was within reach. The system they had all worked within for so long was flawed, but it wasn't beyond redemption. The challenge ahead was enormous, but with Dr. Richardson by his side, and with the knowledge that he wasn't fighting alone, Bennett felt a new sense of purpose. It was time to make the system better, not just for him but for everyone it touched. A week later, Judge Bennett sat alone in his office, reviewing Dr. Richardson's latest report for the 5th time. His lack of sleep was evident in the dark circles under his eyes, but the data was undeniable. The patterns in his rulings that had previously gone unnoticed, or worse, ignored, were now stark, and the weight of them was impossible to deny. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from the committee secretary. Emergency meeting called by Dr. Richardson today at 2 p.m. Topic: recent incident at South Boston Courthouse. Bennett frowned. He hadn't heard about any incident, but the gravity of Dr. Richardson's text told him all he needed to know. Opening his laptop, he began preparing for yet another chapter in this long battle for change, knowing that the work would continue, and that, no matter what came next, he was ready. Judge Michael Bennett had no idea what he was walking into when he entered the committee meeting that afternoon. His stomach dropped as he scrolled through the news on his phone. The headline was unmistakable. Judge Thomas Harris caught on video making racist comments to young attorney. His heart raced as he clicked on the article, his mind reeling at the implications. Thomas Harris had been one of his closest friends on the bench for years. To see him caught on tape making discriminatory remarks was jarring. The video was recorded by the courthouse's security system, and its contents were now in the public eye. By 2 p.m., the committee had gathered in the Parker and Hayes conference room. The atmosphere was tense, thick enough to cut with a knife. Each member of the committee was silent, their expressions grim as they waited for the meeting to begin. Dr. Angela Richardson entered the room last, carrying a USB drive. There were no pleasantries exchanged. She immediately walked to the conference room's computer system and plugged it in. "I think we all need to watch this," she said firmly, her voice carrying the weight of authority that had become familiar to Bennett over the past few weeks. As the video began to play on the large screen, Judge Bennett's stomach churned. In the footage, Judge Harris could be clearly heard making offensive and discriminatory comments to a young black attorney in his chambers. Harris, unaware he was being recorded, spoke without restraint. The young attorney who had come in to present evidence for a case was subjected to a barrage of racial stereotypes and derogatory remarks that had no place in a courtroom, let alone a judge's chambers. Bennett felt sick to his stomach as he watched, every word feeling like a punch to his gut. When the video ended, Dr. Richardson stood up and turned on the lights, her eyes locking onto Bennett's. "This," she said, gesturing toward the screen, "is exactly why our work matters." She paused, letting her words sink in. "It's why we need every member of this committee to be fully committed to change." Her gaze didn't waver. She was addressing the room, but her words were pointed directly at Bennett, who was sitting uncomfortably in his chair. He could feel every eye in the room on him, and he knew that his role in this process was far from finished. Judge Bennett cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. He knew the room was waiting for him to speak, especially since Harris had been his closest friend on the bench for 2 decades. "Judge Harris has served for 20 years with distinction," he began, his voice measured but shaking slightly. "This video is troubling, yes, but surely it's not the full picture. Would you like to see his ruling statistics?" he asked, hoping to offer some context, some defense of his friend's character. But Dr. Richardson was already one step ahead. She interrupted him, pulling out another folder from her briefcase. "I have those too," she said flatly, her eyes meeting his. The folder was thick with case statistics, and Bennett immediately recognized the pattern. "Similar to what we discussed last week," she added, her tone purposeful. Bennett's heart sank as she opened the folder and began passing out the printed documents. These statistics were damning, reflecting the same racial biases that had been uncovered in his own rulings. The room fell silent. Every committee member shifted uncomfortably in their seats as they began to grasp the extent of the problem. Dr. Richardson's thorough analysis of Judge Harris's cases showed a pattern of disproportionate treatment towards black defendants, much like the patterns Bennett had seen in his own data just days before. Harris's rulings were not just biased, they were egregiously unfair. His decisions were marred by assumptions based on race, class, and background. As Bennett stared at the numbers, he felt a deep pang of guilt. His friend had been judging others unfairly just as he had, and he hadn't even realized it. An older lawyer, one of the committee members, spoke up. "Surely you understand," the man said with a gruff voice, "these things take time to change. The system is too entrenched. It doesn't just change overnight." He glanced at Dr. Richardson as if her passion was too much to accept. Dr. Richardson didn't back down. She stood up, her body language assertive. "The system," she said firmly, "is exactly what we're here to fix. We can't just let it continue because it's difficult to change. Change is hard, yes, but it's necessary. We are the ones who have the power to make that change." Bennett felt the weight of her words. He had heard all the excuses before, heard them from other judges who didn't want to confront the uncomfortable truths of their own biases. But Dr. Richardson wasn't letting anyone off the hook. She was challenging the entire room to take responsibility for the broken system they were a part of. And she wasn't going to let anyone ignore it. The silence that followed her statement felt thick, heavy. Finally, one of the committee members, the young black attorney who had appeared in the video, spoke up. "Last month," he began, his voice calm but firm, "I appeared in traffic court with clear evidence of my innocence. The judge wouldn't even look at my documentation before finding me guilty and imposing the maximum fine. That judge didn't care about the facts, he only cared about what he assumed about me." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This is the system we're working in," he added quietly. A few committee members exchanged looks, slowly realizing the connection. The room became electric with the weight of the moment. Bennett sat back, stunned. The walls in his mind had begun to crumble, and for the first time, he could see the full extent of the problem. He wasn't just complicit in a broken system. He had been a part of it, perpetuating the very biases that Dr. Richardson had exposed. The moment stretched on, and Bennett knew he couldn't sit in silence any longer. He stood up suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension. "Dr. Richardson is right," he said, his words ringing out across the room. The others turned to look at him, their expressions surprised. He was known for his calm, measured responses, but this time his voice was firm, unwavering. "I was that judge she's talking about. I was wrong." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Bennett could feel the weight of the committee's gaze upon him. His collar suddenly felt too tight and his palms were sweaty, but the admission was out. There was no taking it back. Dr. Richardson's expression softened slightly, but she remained professional. "Thank you, Judge Bennett," she said, her tone acknowledging his courage. "That's a start." The discussion shifted back to the task at hand. Dr. Richardson took control, outlining the steps necessary for change. They talked about the need for new guidelines for judicial conduct, mandatory bias training, and a review system for court decisions. Bennett participated actively, offering insights from his own experience and acknowledging areas where change was needed. He no longer felt like an outsider in the room. He was part of the solution now, fully committed to the work that lay ahead. As the meeting came to a close, people filed out quietly, still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. Dr. Richardson stayed behind, organizing her papers. Bennett stood near the door, briefcase in hand. "That couldn't have been easy," she said, not looking up from her work. "No," Bennett admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But it was necessary." She finally looked up, meeting his gaze. "You know this is just the beginning, right?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. "Real change takes more than one admission in one meeting." "I know," he said, nodding. "And I have a lot of work to do. Starting with reviewing every traffic court case I've handled in the past year." Dr. Richardson raised an eyebrow. "Every case?" she asked, clearly skeptical. "Every single one," he confirmed. "Would you be willing to help me identify the patterns I might have missed?" She studied him for a long moment, assessing his sincerity. Finally she nodded. "Tomorrow, 7 a.m. in my office. Bring coffee. It's going to be a long day." As Bennett walked to his car that evening, he felt both exhausted and energized. For the first time in his career, he was seeing his role through new eyes. The weight of his past decisions was heavy, but the path forward was clear. His phone buzzed again. Another text from the committee secretary. "Judge Harris resigned, effective immediately." Bennett deleted the message without responding. Some bridges needed to burn for new ones to be built. The next morning, Judge Bennett strode through the gleaming glass doors of Parker and Hayes law firm. The prestigious firm occupied the top 3 floors of a downtown Boston skyscraper, with views that stretched across the harbor. He arrived 20 minutes early, as was his habit, dressed in his finest charcoal gray suit. "Good morning, Judge Bennett," the receptionist greeted him warmly. "The meeting room isn't quite ready yet, but you're welcome to wait in our lobby." He nodded, sitting in one of the expensive leather chairs. As he pulled out his phone to check his emails, the lobby slowly filled with other committee members, judges, lawyers, and community leaders. At exactly 9 a.m., a young associate appeared. "The Maple Room is ready for the Judicial Reform Committee meeting," she announced. "Please follow me." Judge Bennett walked in first, naturally assuming his usual seat at the head of the table. He began arranging his papers, barely glancing up as the others filed in. Thomas Hayes, the managing partner of Parker and Hayes, stood at the front of the room, waiting for everyone to settle before beginning. "Before we begin," Hayes said, smiling broadly, "I'd like to introduce our newest partner and your new committee co-chair." The door opened one last time, and Judge Bennett's hand froze mid-motion as Dr. Angela Richardson walked into the room. She wore a striking burgundy ensemble that commanded attention, and her face was unmistakable. "Dr. Angela Richardson," Hayes continued proudly, "is our newest partner at the firm, the youngest in our history. With her Harvard Law degree, doctorate in criminal justice reform, and extensive work in civil rights law, she'll be an invaluable addition to the committee." Dr. Richardson's eyes met Bennett's, and he saw the same slight smile from yesterday cross her face. She walked confidently to the front of the room. "Thank you, Tom," she said warmly. "I'm excited to work with everyone here to create meaningful change in our judicial system." Her gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on Bennett. Some committee members chuckled. not understanding the weight behind her words. Bennett felt heat rising in his collar as he remembered his dismissive treatment of her just 24 hours ago. Dr. Richardson will be co-chairing this committee with Judge Bennett, Hayes announced. They'll work together to address systemic issues in our courts and propose new reforms. As Hayes spoke, Bennett realized something had shifted. His role in this fight was no longer defined by his past mistakes. It was now defined by the potential for change, the possibility of transformation, and the strength of the partnership he had with Dr. Richardson. For the first time, he was not just part of the problem. He was part of the solution. Judge Michael Bennett sat at the head of the polished mahogany table in the conference room at Parker and Hayes Law Firm, watching as Dr. Angela Richardson took her seat directly across from him. The symbolism of the moment wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Two equal leaders facing each other across the gleaming surface, beginning what was to be a partnership that would forever change the judicial system they both inhabited. The room was filled with tension, but also a quiet sense of anticipation. This was the beginning of something important, a reckoning that none of them could escape. Dr. Richardson opened her leather briefcase, the same one she had carried into court the day before, and began pulling out several folders. Bennett's eyes followed her every move, aware that he was now part of a process much larger than himself. He had no idea what he was about to face, but he could feel it already, the inevitable shift in his understanding of justice, the unease gnawing at the pit of his stomach. "I've prepared some initial observations about our current system," she said, her voice confident and calm, including some interesting statistics about traffic court rulings and their correlation with racial demographics. Bennett felt his mouth go dry. His mind was still racing from the previous day, the sudden realization of his own biases, but he forced himself to focus as Dr. Richardson handed out the folders. Each of her movements was deliberate, precise, and purposeful. When she handed him his copy, their eyes met again. There was no anger in her gaze, no resentment, just calm professionalism. And somehow that made him feel even more uncomfortable. "On page 3, Dr. Richardson continued, without missing a beat, you'll find some particularly interesting data about fine disparities and minor violations." She paused for a moment, allowing everyone to turn to the page she had indicated. "For example, just yesterday," she added, "there was a case where a driver, with clear evidence of payment through the city's official parking app, was still fined the maximum amount despite having documentation of a meter malfunction." Bennett watched as several committee members frowned, flipping through the documents, processing the information. He felt every eye in the room occasionally glancing his way, though he doubted anyone had made the connection yet. "This kind of case," Dr. Richardson continued, her voice steady and clear, "represents exactly what we need to address, how our personal biases, perhaps unconscious ones, might affect our judgment and challenge the very notion of equal justice under law." Her words hung in the air, and Bennett felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had spent years in this courtroom, doling out judgments, thinking himself impartial, thinking that his decisions were fair. But Dr. Richardson's research, her observations, were forcing him to confront something he hadn't wanted to face. The idea that biases, hidden, insidious biases, could be shaping the very judgments he handed down was a thought he couldn't easily shake. The meeting continued for the next 2 hours, with Dr. Richardson presenting compelling evidence and thoughtful proposals about judicial reform. She was methodical and incisive, offering practical suggestions for addressing systemic inequalities in the court system. Judge Bennett barely spoke during the entire session. His usual commanding presence had all but disappeared, his voice lost amidst the barrage of data and facts that painted an uncomfortable picture of a justice system that was far from just. The more Dr. Richardson spoke, the more Bennett's sense of control over the situation slipped away. As the meeting wrapped up, members of the committee began gathering their things and filing out of the room. Dr. Richardson was the last to leave. She stood up, gathered her folders and paused at the door, turning to look back at Judge Bennett. Her face was professional, but there was something in her gaze, something that felt like quiet satisfaction. "I look forward to working with you, Judge Bennett," she said, her voice calm and composed. "I believe we have a lot to learn from each other." With that, she left the room, leaving Bennett alone with his thoughts and a stack of papers that would keep him awake all night. He stared at the documents in front of him, trying to process what he had just learned. His mind kept circling back to one question. How many times had he made decisions like the ones Dr. Richardson was describing? How many people had he wrongly judged simply because of his unconscious biases? For the first time, Bennett couldn't escape the feeling that he had been part of the problem, not the solution. The next morning, the sun filtered through the tall windows of Boston Municipal Court, casting long shadows across courtroom 3002. Judge Michael Bennett adjusted his black robe, settling into his leather chair, his face set in its usual stern expression. He was 55 years old, with graying temples and sharp blue eyes, and over the years he had earned a reputation as one of the city's strictest and most efficient judges. But today he felt unsettled, the weight of the previous day's revelations lingering in the back of his mind. "Next case," his clerk called out, shuffling through a stack of papers. Bennett barely looked up, already preparing himself for another busy morning in traffic court. He was used to the routine, fines, dismissals, routine cases. But today there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind that something might be different. A young black woman walked confidently to the podium, her navy blue suit perfectly tailored, her natural hair styled professionally, and carrying a leather briefcase that looked far more expensive than what typical traffic court visitors brought. Bennett glanced up briefly but didn't recognize her immediately. "Case number 2374, parking violation on Commonwealth Avenue," the clerk announced. Judge Bennett nodded, scanning his papers as usual. "And how do you plead?" he asked, his tone already carrying a hint of impatience. The court had a full docket today, and he was eager to move through it quickly. "Not guilty, Your Honor," the woman responded clearly, her voice carrying the educated tone of someone used to speaking in professional settings. "I have evidence that the parking meter was malfunctioning that day." Bennett's eyebrows raised slightly, more from annoyance than genuine interest. He had heard every excuse in the book during his 15 years on the bench. "Proceed," he said flatly, barely looking up from his papers. Dr. Richardson pulled out her phone and several printed documents. "Your Honor, I have time-stamped photos showing that I paid for 2 hours of parking through the city's official parking app. I also have my receipt." "Miss Richardson," Judge Bennett interrupted, emphasizing the "miss" despite the doctor clearly written on her citation. "Are you suggesting that our city's parking enforcement officer made a mistake?" "No, Your Honor," Dr. Richardson responded calmly. "I'm presenting evidence that the meter malfunctioned. I even reported it to the city's parking authority that same day. I have the complaint number." Judge Bennett waved his hand dismissively. "The officer's report clearly states that the meter showed no payment at 2:15 p.m. on the day in question. These machines are regularly maintained and tested. But Your Honor, if you just look at my evidence—" "That's enough," Judge Bennett said firmly, his voice carrying the finality that had intimidated countless defendants before her. "This court has a full docket today. The fact remains that the officer found your vehicle in violation, and the fine is $120. Dr. Richardson stood straight, her dignity intact despite the judge's dismissive treatment. "Your Honor, I would like to request. Would you like to make it $150 for wasting the court's time?" Judge Bennett asked, looking down at her over his reading glasses. The courtroom fell silent. A few observers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, watching the interaction with concerned expressions. Dr. Richardson took a deep breath, clasping her hands firmly in front of her. Something flickered in her dark brown eyes, not defeat, but rather a quiet determination. "No, Your Honor," she replied calmly, her voice steady. "Pay the fine within 30 days, Judge Bennett declared, already looking at the next case file. "Next." Dr. Richardson gathered her documents with deliberate movements, tucking them neatly into her briefcase. As she turned to leave, she paused for just a moment and looked back at the judge, who had already forgotten her presence. A slight smile crossed her lips, one that suggested she knew something he didn't. The rest of the morning proceeded as usual for Judge Bennett. He handed out fines, dismissed excuses, and maintained what he considered to be proper order in his courtroom. By lunchtime, Dr. Richardson was just another face in the parade of traffic violators he dealt with daily. As he packed up his papers that afternoon, his clerk handed him a reminder note about tomorrow's meeting at Parker and Hayes Law Firm. He was to meet his new co-chair for the city's Judicial Reform Committee, a civil rights attorney, some hotshot who had recently become a partner at Parker and Hayes. Bennett muttered to himself, not particularly interested. "They say she's brilliant," his clerk mentioned, barely looking up from the desk. "Graduated top of her class at Harvard Law, got her PhD in criminal justice reform, and just became a partner at Parker and Hayes." "Great," Bennett muttered, barely listening. "I've been heading this committee alone for 5 years. I'm not thrilled about sharing the responsibility." He didn't know it yet, but his ordinary Monday was about to become the catalyst for an extraordinary change in his life, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about justice, prejudice, and his own buried biases.